throughout the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of Moses, we find God warning Israel about not becoming defiled with the practices and doctrines which are called the abominations of the nations. 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 14. Moreover, all the leaders of the priests, notice it started with the priesthood, all the leaders of the priests and the people transgressed more and more according to all the abominations of the nations, and defiled the house of the Lord which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. In other words, time and again, God says that Israel, in spite of the fact that he had warned them not to become defiled with the abominations of the nations, they became defiled with the practices, with the teachings of these pagan nations. Now, as we noticed in our study last time, the Christian church has repeated the history of ancient Israel. The Apostle Paul, as we noticed in our last lecture, said that he had betrothed the Corinthians, or the church, to Christ as a virgin. In other words, the church in its original state, as we find in the book of Acts, was a pure church. It was the bride of Jesus Christ. But very early in her history, we noticed last night, that the apostasy entered the Christian church. The man of sin sat in the temple of God, showing himself to be God. And of course, the temple of God is the church. Very early in the history of the early church, we're talking about even towards the end of the 1st century, the church began assimilating the beliefs, practices, and customs of the pagan nations that they came in contact with. And thus, the church of Jesus Christ, the bride of Jesus, whom Paul had betrothed to Jesus Christ, who was supposed to be a chaste virgin to Jesus, now became Babylon. In other words, the church repeated the history of God's Old Testament people. Even, as I mentioned, at the latter part of the 1st century, she allowed the practices of the pagan nations, Rome and other nations, to encroach upon herself, and thus she lost her simplicity and her purity. And in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, we find a description of that church that had apostatized from Jesus Christ. In fact, it's interesting. I'm going to share with you some details that we studied last time, but before I share these details, I'd just like to say that a few years ago I was speaking in Argentina, and I presented the topic that I gave last night, a little bit different slant, but I presented it, all of the characteristics of the apostate church in Revelation chapter 17. But at the end of the presentation, I never mentioned who these characteristics applied to. Well, the next morning, I had interviews with the students in the morning and I preached in the evening. So the next morning, a student came to the office and wanted an interview with me. I said, sure, come on in. She looked at me in the eye and she said, Pastor Bor, I want you to know that you offended me last night. I said, really? I'm really sorry I offended you. What do you mean I offended you? She says, well, you spoke badly about my church.